My name is Elena Marlowe. I'm 36 years old, and if there's one truth I've carried with me, it's this. Family can heal you, or it can wound you for life. That truth never leaves. It lingers like a shadow, following me even into moments that should feel safe. That Sunday evening, as I stepped into my parents' home, I felt it instantly. The air was too still, too heavy, as though the house itself was holding its breath. My mother greeted me with a smile stretched wider than it should be. My father's handshake was firm and formal, more like a contract than a welcome. And my younger sister, Lila, her eyes darted with that gleam I knew too well. It was the look she wore as a child when she had set a trap and waited for me to fall into it. The dining room table sparkled with my mother's best china, crystal glasses, and a centerpiece of lilies. It was beautiful, almost festive, but beauty, I've learned, often hides something else. I took my usual seat across from Lila. Her smile widened, almost victorious. And that's when I saw it. A manila folder tucked beneath my father's napkin. Just a corner peeking out, but enough to make my stomach tighten. He glanced at it once, then again, his jaw tightening the way it always did before a negotiation. In that instant, I knew. This wasn't just dinner, it was an ambush. And maybe you know that feeling too, that heavy moment when a family gathering suddenly feels less like love and more like strategy. If you've ever been in that place, I hope you'll stay with me through this story. And if it speaks to something inside you, I'd be grateful if you liked this video and subscribed, so we can keep building a space where people who felt invisible can finally be seen. For a fleeting second, the smell of roast beef and Parker House rolls almost convinced me this was an ordinary Sunday meal, but deep down I knew better. Memories have a way of warning us, and mine told me clearly, tonight the storm was waiting. My father set his fork down with a sharp clink against my mother's fine china, the sound slicing through the room like a blade. His gaze lingered on the manila folder tucked by his plate, and for a moment, I saw the look that haunted much of my childhood, the look of a man about to strike a deal, not sit down with his daughter. "Your mother and I," he began, his voice calm, measured, the voice he used in boardrooms, "have been thinking about the future of your clinic." My clinic. The words rang in my head, hollow and heavy. "It's not just your clinic anymore, dear," my mother said smoothly, her hand brushing against mine in a performance of warmth. "It's a family legacy now. Family businesses need family management." Before I could speak, Lila practically burst with eagerness. She slid a stack of papers across the table, her smile glowing with triumph. "I've drawn up a business plan," she announced. "I'll be your practice manager. I'll take care of the tedious office work while you focus on patients. And in exchange, only 25% of the profits. That's a fair share, considering the growth I'll bring." The words hit me like ice water. 25%, a quarter of everything I had sacrificed for. Long nights in the clinic, eating ramen while paying down student loans. Years of sleeping on treatment tables because I couldn't afford both rent and malpractice insurance. All those moments of building brick by brick while my family looked the other way. And now Lila, who once nearly destroyed my reputation by handing out unauthorized discounts to her sorority sisters, was asking for a stake in the very thing I had bled for. I lowered my fork to my plate with deliberate care. The taste of roast beef vanished into dust in my mouth. "You've worked yourself too hard, Elena," my father said, sliding the folder toward me as though the matter were already settled. "This is what family does. We step in. With our support, you can focus on being the healer you're meant to be. With our support." The words twisted inside me. Where was that support when I needed a co-signer for my first loan? When I begged them to come to my doctoral ceremony, when I worked double shifts to pay for Lila's housing crisis while she bounced between jobs. Lila leaned forward, her voice bubbling with excitement. "I can start tomorrow. I've even got ideas for redecorating the office. Make it warmer, more welcoming. People love my style." Her voice grated against the silence inside me. She thought this was hers to take. They all did. I lifted my eyes and studied each of them. My mother with her carefully arranged compassion, my father with his business-like certainty, Lila with her glittering self-assurance. For years, I had been the invisible one, the dependable one, the one they could lean on while celebrating someone else. And now, they wanted to turn my life's work into a family piggy bank. The air in the room pressed heavy against my chest. For a moment, I thought I might break under it, as I had so many times before. But something different stirred within me this time. Not resignation, not silence, something sharper, steadier. I reached for the leather briefcase at my side, its weight a reminder of who I had become without them. My fingers brushed over the clasp, and I felt the calm of preparation settle into me. "Before we discuss this further," I said quietly, my voice carrying more steel than I expected, "there's something you should see." The table stilled. Lila's smile faltered just slightly. My father's brow furrowed, and my mother's hand froze in midair, her carefully choreographed gesture of comfort suspended. For the first time in years, I felt the ground shift. This time, not beneath me, but beneath them. The room went still as my words settled between us. The only sound was the faint clink of crystal as my mother adjusted her glass, her fingers trembling just slightly. My father leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing in a way I remembered from my teenage years, the look he wore when I dared to challenge him. And Lila, once so smug, tilted her head in confusion, as if she couldn't imagine I had anything worth showing. With careful, deliberate movements, I placed my briefcase on the edge of the table. The leather creaked softly as I opened the clasps, the sound echoing in the quiet dining room. I drew out a folder, black and heavy, its pages neatly aligned. Years of sacrifice, of record-keeping, of carrying receipts and reports late into the night, all of it was in here, waiting. "This," I said quietly, sliding the folder across the polished wood toward my father, "is the management agreement I signed 3 weeks ago with Colorado Healthcare Partners. They now handle all administrative aspects of my clinic, which means there is no position for you, Lila." Her smile faltered, confusion flashing across her face. You made a decision like that without telling us?" My father snatched the folder, flipping through the pages, his brow furrowed. "You can't make binding agreements without family consultation." "Actually," I replied, steady, "I can. Section 4.3, highlighted for your convenience. No family members may be employed in management without unanimous board approval, and the board now consists of myself and 2 CHP partners. So no, Dad, this isn't a family business. It's mine." The silence stretched. My mother's hand fluttered toward her throat, that same familiar gesture she used whenever the ground shifted beneath her. Lila's cheeks flushed red, her voice rising in disbelief. "You did this on purpose. You shut me out before I even had a chance." I met her gaze evenly. "No, Lila. I made a business decision. Based on experience from the briefcase, I pulled another folder, this one thinner, but heavier in meaning. I laid it gently on the table and slid it toward her. These," I said, "are the patient complaints from the summer you worked at the clinic. Double bookings, hours-long waits, people turned away, unauthorized discounts to your sorority sisters, 31 billing code errors that nearly triggered an audit." Her mouth opened, but no words came. The folder sat untouched in front of her, its thickness speaking louder than any excuse she could summon. "Everyone makes mistakes when they're learning," my mother said softly, reaching toward me as if she could smooth away the weight of her daughter's failures with a touch. "These weren't learning mistakes," I answered. My voice shook just slightly, but I steadied it. "They were careless. They were reckless, and they nearly cost me everything I'd built." From my briefcase, I drew one last document. This one I placed carefully in the center of the table, where all 3 could see. "This is the financial breakdown from my accountant. Over the last 3 years, I provided this family with $42,000 worth of free treatments. Dad, your rotator cuff therapy. Mom, your plantar fasciitis sessions. Lila, your massages before vacations. While you enjoyed those services, I was working double shifts in the hospital cafeteria to make my student loan payments. While you benefited, I ate noodles on clinic tables I couldn't afford to replace. The weight of my words sank into the silence. My father's confident mask cracked just slightly. My mother lowered her eyes, her fingers twisting her napkin. Lila stared at the folder in front of her, as if it might burn her. "I built this clinic with my own hands," I said, standing slowly, my height for once giving me power over the table. "I bled for it. I sacrificed for it. And while I did, you stood back and watched. You never asked how I was surviving. You never came to my ceremonies, my milestones, but the moment it turned into success, suddenly it's ours. Suddenly it's convenient to call it family." My father tried to rally. "We can negotiate. 20% instead of 25, a trial period. You'll see the value." I closed the folder with a firm snap, sliding it back into my briefcase. "No, Dad. I've already seen the value, and I refuse to pay for the same lesson twice." The words hung heavy in the air, a truth that had been waiting years to be spoken. For the first time that evening, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not just anger, not just hurt, but clarity. The realization that I no longer needed their approval, their validation, or their presence to define my worth. As I fastened the clasps of my briefcase, I caught Lila's eyes one last time. The triumph she wore so easily was gone, replaced by something rawer, almost fragile, fear. And in that moment, I understood. The balance of power had shifted. The dining room fell into a tense silence after my words. My briefcase sat at my side, its weight suddenly lighter, as though each document I had laid on the table had unburdened me. My father stared at me, his jaw clenched, while my mother's hands trembled against the folds of her napkin. Lila shifted in her seat, her face pale, lips pressed tightly together. For a moment I thought it was over, that perhaps, finally, the truth had sunk deep enough to stop them. My father's shoulders slumped, my mother looked away, and even Lila seemed subdued. But then, her eyes changed, the confusion melted, the fear evaporated, and what replaced it was sharper, calculated. "You think you've won," Lila said suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence. "But you don't know everything." I tilted my head, watching her carefully. "What are you talking about?" She smirked, a flash of the same self-assured arrogance I had seen earlier in the evening. "You act like you're untouchable, Elena. Like you've built this perfect little fortress no one can get inside. But I already have." My stomach twisted. A sinking sensation took hold, colder than the chill from before. "Explain," I demanded. With an almost theatrical flair, Lila reached into her purse and pulled out a sleek folder of her own. She placed it squarely on the table, sliding it toward me with the same smugness she'd shown when she first announced her business plan. "These," she said sweetly, "are the credit applications and service agreements I filed using your name. Well, technically, your credentials." She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Turns out, having a sister who's a licensed professional makes things easier. Lenders trust a doctor of physical therapy more than they trust someone still bouncing between jobs." Her words hit me like a blow. I could feel my breath catch, my chest tighten. Slowly, I opened the folder, my eyes scanning over copies of forms, my name, my license number, my clinic's address, all forged, all tied back to me. I looked up, my voice barely above a whisper. "You used my identity." Lila shrugged. "I needed a little help." "I knew you wouldn't mind. You've always covered for me before." My father's eyes widened as he leaned forward. "Lila, what have you done?" His voice carried more panic than anger. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her throat again. Though this time it wasn't the rehearsed gesture of guilt, this time it was genuine shock. I held the papers in my hands, each one heavier than the last. Years of clawing my way out of debt, of protecting my reputation, of building trust with patients and partners, now threatened because my own sister had used me as collateral. The betrayal cut deeper than anything before. This wasn't just greed, this was sabotage. "You could ruin me," I whispered, my voice trembling but steadying with each word. "Do you even understand what you've done?" If the state board sees this, I could lose my license, my clinic, everything. Lila's eyes flickered just for a second with something like doubt, but pride quickly masked it. Relax. Nobody's going to find out. I've got it under control. I pushed the folder back toward her, the pages sliding across the polished wood like sharp edges. No, Lila. You've never had anything under control. And now you've crossed a line I can't ignore. The tension in the room deepened. My father finally found his voice, stern and low. This is fraud. Do you realize the risk you've put this family in? This family? I shot back, my anger finally breaking free. Don't you dare make this about all of us. I didn't sign those papers. I didn't commit fraud. She did, and she used me to do it. My mother's eyes filled with tears, her voice cracking. Elena, please, don't escalate this. She's your sister. Surely we can find a way. I turned on her, my voice sharp. She's not just my sister in this moment. She's a criminal who put my entire life's work on the line because she thought I would clean up the mess like always. The words hung heavy, impossible to ignore. Lila's bravado faltered, her lips trembling. You wouldn't report me. For the first time all evening, I felt the power shift completely. My hands no longer shook, my voice no longer wavered. Don't test me, Lila. I've spent my life paying the price for your mistakes, but this is different. This is the line between forgiveness and consequences. The silence that followed was suffocating. My father buried his face in his hands, muttering curses under his breath. My mother wept quietly, torn between her daughters. And Lila, her shoulders sagged, her mask of arrogance slipping until she looked younger, smaller, almost desperate. But I didn't let that sway me. Not this time. I closed my briefcase, the snap echoing through the dining room like the final stroke of a gavel. You wanted to turn my clinic into a family business? Well, congratulations. You've just turned it into evidence. I stood slowly, pushing my chair back. The hardwood groaned under its weight, the sound breaking whatever illusion of control my family still clung to. From this point forward, I don't owe you explanations. I don't owe you favors, and I will not carry the burden of your choices any longer. I turned toward the doorway, the folder still clutched in my hand. For years, I had walked out of this house feeling smaller than when I came in, but tonight, with betrayal burning behind me, I felt taller. And though my heart ached, though the wound was raw, there was clarity in the pain. I was done being invisible. The dining room still echoed with the snap of my briefcase. The sound seemed to linger in the air, louder than my mother's muffled sobs or the frantic whisper of my father's curses. I stood by the chair I had just pushed back, breathing slowly, grounding myself in the decision I knew I had to make. For a long moment, no one spoke. My father finally raised his head, his face blotched red with anger. You've changed, Elena, he said bitterly. Success has made you cold. I met his gaze without flinching. No, success has made me visible, and you don't know what to do with a daughter you can't ignore. His jaw worked, but no words came. My mother reached across the table, her fingers trembling as they grazed the air between us. Please, sweetheart, she whispered, her voice thick with tears. Don't do this to us. We've always been proud of you. I cut her off, my voice firm, though my heart trembled beneath it. Proud? Where was that pride when you skipped my graduation, when you photographed Lila in my cap and gown instead of standing with me? When I opened my clinic and you couldn't stay longer than 15 minutes because you had dinner plans? She drew back, stricken, her hand falling uselessly to her lap. And you, Lila. My sister stiffened as I turned my eyes on her. You've taken my money, my patience, my silence. You've risked my reputation, my livelihood, and every time you've looked at me as though it was my duty to clean up your mess. But tonight, that ends. Lila's lips parted, her voice shaky now, stripped of its earlier bravado. It's not fair, she whispered. You get everything, respect, success, the clinic. What do I get? For a fleeting second, I saw the little sister I used to carry piggyback across the yard, the girl who clung to me during thunderstorms. But that image was gone in an instant, swallowed by the reality of the woman before me, the woman who had just tried to burn down my life. "You get the consequences of your choices," I said quietly. I straightened my shoulders, the weight of years pressing but no longer crushing. Then, slowly, carefully, I laid out the boundaries that had been building inside me for decades. "From this day forward," I began, "my clinic is not a family business. It belongs to me. My decisions are mine alone. No more input, no more suggestions, no more backroom deals with my colleagues." I paused, letting the words settle, watching them shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Second," I continued, "all treatments for this family will be billed at standard rates. My clinic's charity is for people who truly cannot afford care, not for those who simply refuse to pay." My father's face darkened, his lips parting to protest, but I raised my hand and he fell silent. "And third," I said, my voice steady as steel, "none of you will ever again describe yourselves as partners or owners in what I've built. That lie ends tonight." The words landed like hammer blows. My mother wept openly now, her shoulders shaking. My father glared at me, his anger simmering, but beneath it I caught something else. Fear. And Lila, always quick with excuses, sat frozen, her eyes glistening, her mouth pressed into a hard line. I took a slow breath, allowing the silence to stretch. For the first time in my life, I wasn't shrinking beneath their disapproval. I was standing taller because of it. "This is not me choosing business over family," I added softly, my voice gentler but still unyielding. "This is me choosing boundaries over exploitation. If you can't accept that, then you'll have no place in my life, not in my clinic, not in my home, not in my future." The weight of those words filled the room. No one argued, no one dared. I gathered my briefcase, its handle firm in my grasp. My chair stood empty at the table, but I didn't feel absence. I felt freedom. As I moved toward the door, my father muttered under his breath, "You'll regret this." I stopped, turned just enough to meet his eyes. "No," I said. "For the first time I won't." And with that, I walked away from the table that had bound me for too long into a night that suddenly felt wider, clearer, and, for the first time in years, mine. The night air met me like a balm as I stepped outside. For the first time in years, I didn't feel smaller when leaving my parents' house. I felt taller. The weight I had carried since childhood, of being overlooked, dismissed, used, slipped from my shoulders with every step I took toward my car. Back at my clinic the next morning, the world looked different. The waiting room bustled with patients, not relatives demanding favors. My staff greeted me with genuine smiles, the kind that carry respect instead of expectation. These were the people who had stood beside me during late nights, who had stayed long after hours to fix the mistakes others left behind. They weren't bound to me by blood, but by loyalty, by compassion, by a shared vision of healing. "Morning, Dr. Marlowe," my clinic manager said warmly as she placed a fresh cup of coffee on my desk. "We've got a full day ahead, but I thought you might need this first." Her small gesture filled me with a gratitude I rarely felt at home. It reminded me that family isn't always the one you're born into. It's the one you build, choice by choice, moment by moment. Later that afternoon, as I guided an elderly patient through her final therapy session, she grasped my hand, her eyes brimming with tears. "You've given me back more than movement," she whispered. "You've given me hope." Those words, simple yet profound, settled deep inside me. They meant more than any hollow praise from parents who never saw me. In that moment, I knew with absolute clarity I had finally drawn the line between who I was expected to be and who I truly am. That evening, I sat in my office as the sun dipped low over the city skyline. I looked around at the framed photos of my team, the community awards, the business license that once felt like a fragile dream, and I smiled. Not because everything was easy, but because for the first time, everything was mine. I realized then that setting boundaries doesn't make you unkind. It doesn't make you cold. It makes you whole. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever had to choose boundaries over approval, I invite you to like this video and subscribe. Share your story in the comments because here, your voice matters. Boundaries aren't selfish, they are survival. And with that, I closed my office door for the night, ready to step into tomorrow not as the daughter they tried to control, but as the woman I had fought to become.